Society of Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. We have been talking about animals for the last couple of weeks, the theological implications of how we see animals, all the way from the ancient world to what Darwin thinks about animals and how we kind of think about them nowadays and are readjusting to how animals exist in our minds, all the way from the lion and the lamb, which is a misquotation of the book of Isaiah, to the ideas that animals have been with people from the beginning, very obviously. And yes, non human animals and human animals have evolved together over time. So we know them pretty well. As I mentioned on Tuesday, Aesop may or may not have lived. If he did, it was somewhere in the 500s and 600s before the Common Era. He is credited with collecting oral stories using the fable format, which is very specific, meaning that he has talking animals and animals acting in an anthropomorphized manner in order to teach moral lessons. I mentioned on Tuesday that we have a long history in the Christian world of using animals for the sake of symbolism and imagery. From the medieval bestiary, which I highly recommend you do some looking online. There's some amazing illustrations from that time period. But for example, the pelican was seen as a self-sacrificing mother. She would tear her heart out and feed the blood to her babies when they were starving, and how the medieval priests used this as a lesson for the bleeding heart of Jesus. Well, let's go to a little more contemporary time period now. I want to first look at an early illustrator, E.H. Shepard, who lived from 1879 to 1976. He illustrated two books famously, The Wind in the Willows and Winnie the Pooh. He's also a fascinating characterist in other ways. These are what he's really known for. But he was also very much a commentator on the First World War, for example. So he bears some checking out online, and there are some good sources out there. But you immediately recognize Winnie the Pooh in the way that he drew Winnie the Pooh and the various animals, created quite the archetypal animals for the Pooh series. He also did, again, the Wind in the Willows. And again, you immediately recognize these characters, and they have stuck with us as kind of archetypal, anthropomorphized animals over time. I want to switch gears a little bit and look at how we maybe use fable nowadays. A book published in 1945, just before the end of the Second World War, Animal Farm, a fairy story by George Orwell. You may know Animal Farm, you may even have read it. You may not know that George Orwell at first called it a fairy story. This was from the first edition of the book. That subtitle never came to the publications in the United States. The interesting thing is that George Orwell is wrong about that. Animal Farm is not a fairy story. It is instead a fable, and maybe some other things. But a fairy story is very traditional in the way that it works. It's probably more properly called a fable, allegory, or a satire in terms of Animal Farm, not a fairy tale, because fairy tales are deep oral histories. They're often treated nowadays as revelatory of psychological states. Jack Zipes is one of the preeminent scholars in fairy tales these days. He has this book called The Irresistible Fairy Tale, The Cultural and Social History of a Genre. And again, fairy tale, very old, oral in their composition and in their sources from folk traditions, but not exactly what Animal Farm was doing. I like a quote from G.K. Chesterton. You may know him as the author of the Father Brown books. He had this to say: Fairy tales do not tell children that the dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed. And I think that's a good insight into how fairy tales operate. Yes, often they seem very, very scary. Is that witch going to be able to cook the kids and that kind of thing? But indeed, they get themselves out of those situations. So the terror, the frightening bits of it, probably pre-exist in children's minds, is the psychological argument. And the fairy tales tell us magical ways that can be applied to very human ways of getting out of certain situations. Well, a very interesting article that has come out recently from the Critic at Large, January 24th, 2022 issue of the New Yorker, by Catherine Schultz. Bambi is even bleaker than you thought. The original book is far more grisly than the beloved Disney classic and has an unsettling message about humanity. It's a fascinating article that goes back. Most people, including me, have not read the original Bambi novel, and we don't know really what it is based on. The argument is that actually the author was talking about the time period between the First and Second World Wars when the Jewish population in Vienna were under a lot of stress and strain before the Nazis took over. Felix Salten wrote Bambi, A Life in the Woods. He lived from 1869 to the end of the Second World War, 1945. And indeed, Bambi may well be a fable or trying to express how the Jewish population was being treated in this very jungle world, shall we say, this forest world between the two world wars. Animal Farm, back to that, George Orwell. You'll see if you begin looking for, oh, I want to buy a copy of Animal Farm, you'll see the illustrated Animal Farm, and several different illustrators have done these over time. You'll also run into a 1954 movie. You'll laugh and cry a little at the antics of the animals in Animal Farm, the wonderful length Technicolor cartoon. This was the first full length cartoon produced in Great Britain just after the Second World War. Famously, it was bankrolled by the American CIA as a way to talk about this new world that was appearing after the Second World War during the 1950s, the Iron Curtain and the Cold War that was developing. And Animal Farm certainly can be seen as a way of talking about that, although again, Orwell wrote it before those events actually took place, but he does appear to have been talking about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia during the First World War period. Again, you'll see a lot of these. Illustrators love to use the animals. All animals are created equal was the great catchphrase to lead the animals into a revolution. But by golly, the pigs, the hogs, take over and do some terrible things that have been seen as fascist or as Stalinist. Again, illustrations are all over. Napoleon the pig is the one who takes over. So you can see him in a top hat. You can see him in his uniform. You can see him with his guard dogs and his Napoleon Bonaparte hat on. And the illustrations are quite wonderful, from the movie all the way into our own time. It really gets into people's bloodstream, I think, to think about how these animals are dealing with the Great Revolution. And indeed, updating into our own time, you can get a graphic novel nowadays of George Orwell's Animal Farm, a fable, a satire, something like that. An allegory of how revolution doesn't always turn out as you might wish it would. And when you begin looking at children's books and looking at animals, real and imaginary, you're going to start seeing a lot of that in terms of how we use the animal to be something like a human and teach moral lessons. Why do people use fables? Why do they use animals in fables? Well, for one thing, animals with human characteristics are immediately slightly removed from reality. So, if the bad things that happen when we're talking in fable language aren't nearly as scary as they would be if they were graphically illustrated with real people doing them. Also, animals can be made to resemble specific people without actually mentioning them. You can start looking around, and I found a nice picture of a hog wearing a red hat that says, "Make America Grunt Again." And yes, this is a reference to Animal Farm and Napoleon taking over to rule over the animals. And indeed, you don't even have to say who this is in order to communicate that. And especially in totalitarian cultures, that is very good to be able to dodge. Oh, I didn't really say that. That resemblance, that's completely accidental. I didn't mean to do that at all. Animals can be made to resemble specific people without actually mentioning them. And when you begin to see that, you'll see it everywhere. Current culture war item is Art Spiegelman's Mouse series. And indeed, if you look closely at the illustrations in Mouse, you will see certain historical figures that are communicated without naming them. Well, this is not just something that happened back in the 1950s or the 1930s. We have a lot of fable animal stories going on still nowadays. On network television, BoJack Horseman appears. BoJack Horseman is an anthropomorphized horse who lives in Southern California. Uh, do a little research on this, and I found a nice article saying, let's talk about why BoJack Horseman is a horse man. Now, the article sets up by saying this. Given the name of the show, the question of why BoJack Horseman is half horse, half man may seem a little self-explanatory. Beneath the obvious denotation of BoJack's name, however, you will find layers of clever satire and commentary of modern Hollywood and our own animal nature. Ah, see, that goes right back into the idea of fables. The article goes on to say this. Beyond this, though, there is something about BoJack being a horse which makes the show somehow palatable. If BoJack was a middle-aged man with a human face, watching him constantly abuse the people around him and repeat the same mistakes would be unbearably exhausting. And yes, that's exactly why we use fables, to get that little bit of distance away from seeming to be realistically human so that we can reflect on some aspects of human nature that are probably less than beautiful. And yes, the idea of fables and use of animals will continue in this way. There are certain storylines that would perhaps render BoJack the Man an irredeemable character, says the article. And yet, because BoJack is an oddly charming cartoon horse, we continue to endure his atrocious behavior and self-deprecation. Is this a commentary on how we as an audience consume Hollywood drama? Probably so. Are we being fooled? Maybe so. And that is the essence of fable. Thanks for listening this week. Um, Next week, I'm going to be looking at animals going robot. Yes, we have been living with animals as human beings for a very long time. We have also made animals into a mechanistic thing very often. That goes back to Descartes, but it continues today, as in my illustration with a bionic kangaroo. So tune in next week to talk about that a little bit. I am live on Friday mornings at 9 a.m. Central Time. Join in for a discussion of this week's Coffee and Wisdom themes and other stuff too. And if you don't have that Zoom link, email me, minister@firstunitarian.org. Thanks so much for listening this week, and have a great day.